Which woven neckline are you ready to sew? A few months ago, we posted a video all about necklines. It was called, Which Neckline Am I Ready to Sew? It was a rundown of some of the most common necklines, and it sorted out which are beginner-friendly for sewists, intermediate, and advanced. And why they got that rating, what are the tricky spots, and what patterns are in that category when it comes to Love Notion's necklines. The video focused on knit pattern necklines, and in that video's comments, we got a lot of calls for a woven version. So that's what we're tackling today. Let's get the scoop on woven necklines and figure out which ones you are ready to sew. Now, before we get too far in, let's talk about today's feature pattern, Presto Tunic. This pattern was just updated and it got additional sizes and a done-for-you full bust adjustment. The tutorial also got a little bit of a facelift and it is ready for you to enjoy. Now, if you've previously purchased Presto Tunic, you can get the updated version by just heading into your Love Notions account and re-downloading the pattern from your pattern files on your dashboard. So that's it. There's no extra purchase required. And in fact, when it comes to all Love Notions patterns, anytime we do a pattern update, it is always free. However, if you've never taken a look at Presto, today is definitely the day to do so. So let's take a closer look at this pattern and what makes it so special. Presto Tunic is a woven top that's meant for apparel woven fabrics. This tunic has a looser fit with some gentle shaping with darts at the bust and optional kind of fisheye darts at the back that give some really beautiful shaping and enhance the silhouette of the pattern. The collar of this pattern has two options. You can do a stand-up banded collar, which gives the tunic a really polished look with almost like a little bit of a military flair, or you can really easily make a bias-bound neckline, which can save a ton of time if you're using ready-made bias tape. But if you're like me, I love having matching bias tape, so I had to remember how to do that again. But the finishing on that is really nice, and the sewing of that is very easy. So the focal point of this pattern is that neckline. It is an inset panel with a placket opening. It can look a little tricky, but trust me, the results are so worth it. This inset panel spot is the perfect opportunity to mix up your fabrics and add in some really cool details. For example, you could try a lace overlay. You could try an applique or some embroidery. You could play around with some contrasting or coordinating fabrics on that placket area. Or you could even add a special detail, for example, pin tucks. And the pattern actually has some information on how to create those pin tucks. So to finish the inset panel placket, you could use buttons and buttonholes, you could use snaps, or you could even just completely leave it off and just pair the Presto Tunic with a cami underneath. This inset panel also makes this pattern perfect for nursing moms. Or it can also be a great solution for people who are looking for something that's easy to put over your head. They might have some mobility concerns. And just from a practical standpoint, if you do your hair and makeup before you put your clothes on, this opens up nice and wide so you don't have to mess up anything when you're getting ready. Lastly, the pattern also features a chunky hem with a side seam vent. It has a shortened front and then a longer back. So you could comfortably wear this tunic with leggings or some other bottoms where you might not want to have them be kind of on their own. Or you could easily even out those front and back hems and even shorten it or even lengthen it to either make a regular length top or a dress. So overall, this tunic is an intermediate sew. but it is so satisfying when you complete it, especially that neckline. So let's get into some woven necklines. So now that you know about our feature pattern and some of the details of Presto Tunic, let's dive into understanding which woven neckline you are ready to sew. So I've cataloged a bunch of the Love Notions pattern necklines into some general types. Then I've kind of sorted those types into advanced, intermediate, and beginner categories. So I'm going to let you know which type of neckline is on which patterns, some tricky spots to look out for, and an overall rating of 0 to 10, with 0 being perfect for a complete newbie, and 10 being great for a more advanced sewist who's looking for a little bit of a challenge. So keep in mind that with these ratings, I'm really only going to be discussing the necklines that are on Love Notions patterns. And I hope you know, Love Notions is a very beginner-friendly sewing pattern company. So to be honest, none of these patterns are exceptionally hard or complicated. And we always say that when it comes to difficulty, if you can follow a recipe, you can follow our sewing pattern instructions. If you have just a little bit of experience, you'll be fine with almost any of these necklines and the tutorials that go along with them. And another thing, I'm also going to be switching up the order. So instead of going from easy to hard like I did in the knit video, I will be going in order from harder necklines to easier necklines. But before we get too far in, let's define some terms. First, let's talk about what advanced means. First definition, advanced. I would consider advanced necklines to be the ones that have a whole collection of multiple extra steps, extra pattern pieces, extra ways to finish the fabric, and multiple detailed sewing techniques. So, you know, when it comes to difficulty, maybe having just one of these types of features would make it more of like an intermediate sew, but having just a whole pile of them all together can make it more challenging. And that's where I would bump it up to an advanced category. So for advanced necklines, there might also be several extra challenges in creation or attaching them. So like maybe the join together with, you know, extra layers is really difficult or thick or hard to sew through. Or you've got to do a really precise pivot at a really awkward spot. That would make it advanced. But the good news is that just like that recipe, if you have patience and time, you can just follow the directions, practice it out, and then get to where you need to go. And this is also one of the reasons why doing a muslin is always a great idea. It's another extra opportunity to practice. But sometimes those collection of steps can really pile up, and one wrong move can turn into a whole wreck of mistakes, and it can be so frustrating. So advanced necklines are challenging, but that also means that the finished product is all the more satisfying with a very impressive collection of details and styles once you get it down. Now, what do I mean by intermediate necklines? Like I said before, intermediate I would consider to be necklines that are a step down from advanced because they might just have one of those more complicated multi-step features. And instead of having a whole big collection of them all together. And lastly, what do I think makes a beginner-friendly woven neckline? With these types of necklines, I'm considering the simplicity of the neckline and the process to put it together. Fewer pattern pieces, fewer sewing techniques, less time, and of course, just fewer tutorial steps. All of that makes an easier to sew neckline. So the easier the neckline, of course, the easier it is ideal for a beginner sewist. So beginner necklines, at least when it comes to woven sewing patterns, would be ones that don't require any extra pattern pieces. Maybe it doesn't even require interfacing. Maybe it doesn't require, maybe it's just a pretty quick process with just a few, 2 or 3 separate steps before the neckline is done. Now, before we get into our pattern rundown and rating, here's a couple quick notes about that beginner through advanced neckline category rating. One, it's really important to understand that your fabric choice can really tip the neckline into one category or another. For example, if you're working with a really super tricky, lacy piece of fabric at the neckline with multiple layers, or there's silky or slinky or shifty fabric, or fabric that's just really delicate, that's easily frayed or fragile, that fabric will make the neckline that much harder to sew, especially compared with like working with a basic quilting cotton, which is going to be very easy to sew. And finally, one last caveat about this rating is that these are just my opinions. They're based on my personal sewing experiences with the Love Notions patterns and just sewing in general. So your ratings might be totally different. So let's start with advanced necklines. Of course, we have to start with Presto's neckline. And this definitely belongs in the more advanced grouping of necklines, at least the ones that we have in the Love Notions pattern library. For Presto specifically, the neckline has a collection of more detailed components than your average woven pattern. So let's take a look at each set of them. Number 1, it has a separate collar. This type of collar is called a banded collar, at least for Presto, and some people might even call it like a stand-up collar. It's a separate piece that's interfaced and sewn on. But remember that you could finish off this pattern with just bias tape, which would make it much easier and lower in the categories. So if you count interfacing, that could be like 9 extra pattern pieces to cut out, to mark, to cut out of fabric, and then to keep track of, especially if you count the interfacing. Second, this neckline has a button placket. Now this means that the front neckline opens up and each of those open sides are finished off with an extra strip of interface fabric, and then buttonholes are meant to be installed. This is at least 4 extra pattern pieces to cut out and to put into to join with interfacing, not to mention putting in buttonholes, which is its own potential minefield and can take a ton of time, and it might require a lot of patience. And third, this whole front neckline focal point is a completely separate piece from the main bodice pieces. So it has to be very carefully attached, and attaching the inset panel around the corners especially can be pretty tricky. And that separate inset piece is just another set of pattern pieces as well. So because of those reasons, and especially all those extra pieces, I would give Presto a more advanced rating in terms of the Love Notions pattern library when it comes to woven patterns. And now I'm not saying this to discourage you from taking a look at Presto. Honestly, once you sew it and get it down, it is a breeze, and the results are really, really satisfying. So if you're looking for a fun challenge with a very, very impressive, satisfying result, you really should try this one out. And I would rate it an 8 out of 10 on the Love Notion neckline hardness scale. So what are some other types of necklines that belong into the advanced category? I also think that most patterns with plackets belong in the most advanced category, at least when it comes to Love Notions patterns. I would say that most patterns with plackets offer just a little bit more of a challenge. There are those extra strips of fabric, the interfacing, and most likely those potentially scary buttonholes. So in addition to Presto, patterns with plackets are the V-neck Lyric and the curved V-neck Ballad and that classic button-down aria, which we're going to talk about in a second in a different category. But in terms of plackets, I'd give the patterns Lyric a 6 out of 10 rating. It's just got those plackets at the front opening and then a bunch of buttonholes. And as the rest of the neckline is finished with bias tape. However, I would say that Ballad is probably a little bit more complicated and deserves a 7 out of 10 rating, depending on which options you include or the fabric that you use. Ballad gets a little bit higher on the hard scale simply because of the layers of fabric that all have to get attached together, along with those curved plackets, especially if you're using the shearing technique. And then there's also those buttons to install and buttonholes to install after you get that all in. And if you're following the directions, if you use a fabric that makes sense and is stable, and you bring your patience, you will be just fine. Now, let's get back to aria and talk about another type of neckline, ones with separate collars. Not always, but sometimes collars can not only be time-consuming, but they also can require a higher level of precision, or any of those mistakes that you make will just be front and center. Collared necklines are probably going to require understitching, interfacing, and they might even need some hand sewing. They will probably need to have seams graded, corners cut, and grading a seam means that's where you trim the layers of one seam allowance into just minutely different lengths, which can be really tricky and potentially time consuming if you're new to it. And sometimes it can be kind of risky because you've got those sharp scissors going right along that main fabric. And trust me, that I know. I've cut too many collars. Patterns with separate collars also might require the use of binding to cover that interior seam allowance at the joining of the collar and the neckline opening. And that can be challenging to get just really precise and flat and straight. And it can be especially tough to incorporate the binding at the opening of the neckline, which might even have another placket or a zipper to incorporate all together. So here are some patterns with separate collars in the Love Notions collection. 2 views of the Oakley vest have a separate collar. 1 view of the Coda quilted coat has a separate collar. An Octave coat has a shawl collar or hood with a lining that can definitely present some advanced challenges. So depending on which view you sew, I would give all of these a 5 out of 10 rating on my difficulty scale. Now let's discuss some intermediate types of necklines on Love Notions woven patterns. Like I said before, I consider intermediate necklines to have maybe just 1 or 2 extra of those more time-consuming steps or pattern pieces amount or techniques. So here are a few types of intermediate necklines in my personal order of difficulty. To start, Melody Dolman is just almost into the advanced category simply because it does have a separate collar and interfacing, but the difference with this one is that instead of a traditional placket, Melody has a grown-on facing. That means that the facing is already included in the original pattern piece, and in basic terms, you're just going to fold it over and sew the buttons on with the camp collar. That eliminates lots of extra steps and definitely a few extra pattern pieces. But it does have that extra collar process, and getting everything to line up in the right spots and making all the markings match up can definitely be a challenge. So I would give Melody a 4.99 out of 10. And as far as button up, it definitely is one of the more approachable and easy to sew. Now, speaking of facings, I also consider any neckline that requires a facing to finish it off. I put that on the intermediate list as well. So a facing is an extra piece that is attached at an opening edge, and then it's flipped inside to finish off that opening or a hem or just any raw edge. It requires an extra pattern piece or 2 or 4 that is typically interfaced and finished off with a serger or an overcast stitch, and then it's attached with a straight stitch that might involve some precise pivots or precise seam allowances, and probably will even require some understitching and grading. So here are some examples of necklines with facings. Salt whistle with that pretty square neckline. The strappy tempo sundress with that soft V-neck at the front. Sonata dress. And this one lets you choose from installing the notched facing on the outside of the neckline, or you can put it on the inside. And cadence shift dress with just the most basic scoop neckline facing installation, though you can also step this one up with a cute little notched scoop option too. For another type of more intermediate necklines, I also think that Vivace dolman fits into this category. Vivace has several separate neckline pieces that are going to get interfaced and then installed onto that neckline opening. And that neckline opening also has like a really cute little pleat feature. And this one can be hard to get lined up. And of course, that means there's more pattern pieces and process steps and all that. So where do these rank? Like I said before, Melody is a 4.99. Vivace, I'd say a 4.5. Salt Whistle, a 3. Sonata, a 3. And Cadence, a 3. Okay, we have made it to the beginner-friendly necklines. Let's break down what type of necklines I consider perfect for any complete newbie. One really easy way to finish off a neckline with woven patterns is just with bias tape. You can use double fold or single fold, and this is really the easiest possible way to finish off a plain scoop neckline or a rounded neckline. And you'll just attach that bias tape right sides together, and then either you're gonna fold it up and flip it down to the inside of the neckline, or you could even use that double fold bias tape to let that bias tape show along both the inside and the outside of the neckline. That's kind of how Presto is. You can also do this process with the Rhapsody top and dress, and that's going to use that bias binding to create a really cute set of little ties and a little cute V. And then there is Harmony Blouse, which is an extremely simple, elegant woven pattern. It has just a plain scoop neckline, and it's finished with a piece of single fold bias tape. And the only tricky part on this might be just getting that keyhole closure at the back finished off. But since the bias binding goes right over that opening, it is a cinch to sew. So that's my rating of beginner, intermediate, and advanced necklines on woven patterns, at least when it comes to the Love Notions pattern library. That you see that Love Notions patterns are the perfect place to start for tackling new necklines, especially for a beginner. All you've got to do is just grab a simple woven top and then work your way up according to my ratings, to the more complex pieces after you've got some experience. This way you will not only get some fabulous garments to add to your closet, but you can also add just like a whole bunch of skills to your personal sewing toolbox. You might not know this, but I previously was a teacher before I moved over to Love Notions. And in education, a super important practice in teaching is called scaffolding. And basically that means that you build one skill on top of another. You're going to need to master and understand that bottom layer of skills before you can move up to the next level. And it makes sense in education, and it also makes sense in sewing. Because jumping in off the deep end can really get you discouraged. And it might make you ready to just all the way give up. So I really suggest start smart and tackle stuff that you're ready for, one new technique at a time. And of course, we're here to help all along the way. Thanks for watching this video about the Presto Tunic and the woven necklines that might be ready for you to sew. As for Presto, make sure you get yours before the sale ends and celebrate its re-release with us. The link is below. Make sure you subscribe to watch all of our other pattern videos and sewing tutorials. And go ahead and leave me a comment below with your thoughts on Presto Tunic, on woven necklines, or any other sewing ideas that you have. I'm especially curious to see if you thought my ratings were accurate or not. And are you in the loop with Love Notions sewing goodness? Make sure to join our newsletter to stay up to date with all of the $5 Feature Friday sales, all of our sewing events, and especially our new pattern releases. Oh, and P.S., our new cargo pants pattern is getting polished up for its upcoming release. So make sure to get your buttons and zippers and medium weight wovens ready. Again, all of the links that you might need are in the box below. Thanks for sewing with us. Happy Feature Friday.